What if I told you that some of the wildest science fiction moments ever filmed were buried not because they failed, but because they terrified television censors? Imagine lost episodes erased from vaults, scenes too violent, too philosophical, or too real for the networks that birthed them. Tonight, we dig into 12 moments from retro sci-fi history, so extreme television itself refused to let them air. Number 12. The Outer Limits, The Architects of Fear, 1963. When The Outer Limits first aired, it was hailed as the thinking person's answer to monster television. The episode, The Architects of Fear, dared to ask what would happen if humanity faked an alien invasion to unite the world against itself. It was political allegory disguised as pulp entertainment, and it nearly destroyed the show. The plot follows a secret cabal of scientists who decide to prevent nuclear war by transforming one of their own into an alien creature. Their hope is that fear of a common enemy would erase global conflict. But the result was grotesque. The actor Robert Culp was buried under latex prosthetics, turning him into a trembling creature that looked part ape, part reptile, part nightmare. What began as allegory became visual heresy. ABC executives panicked, calling the imagery too disturbing for television audiences. Some markets refused to broadcast it. Critics accused the episode of manipulating Cold War paranoia for shock value. Network censors demanded that future scripts tone down the body horror and political tension. Behind the scenes, the production team fought bitterly with executives over what sci-fi should be. Was it mere fantasy or moral warning? The writers argued that the episode's horror came not from aliens, but from human desperation. The network disagreed, and their conflict marked the end of creative freedom for the show's first season. Over the decades, The Architects of Fear resurfaced as a cult symbol of courage in censorship. Modern audiences now see it as a time capsule of moral panic. It dared to suggest that humanity's worst monsters might not come from space, but from the laboratories of its own ambition. Number 11. Doctor Who, The Deadly Assassin, 1976. By the mid-70s, Doctor Who had conquered Saturday nights with campy fun and moral lessons hidden behind rubber suits. But when The Deadly Assassin aired, fans were not prepared for the nightmare that followed. This episode was a political thriller laced with surreal torture imagery. The BBC almost pulled it mid-broadcast. The story takes the Doctor back to his home planet Gallifrey, where political conspiracies run deep. But the standout scene, the one that shocked parents across Britain, was the surreal showdown inside the Matrix, a dreamlike computer world that turned thought into flesh. Viewers watched as the Doctor was hunted through swamps, choked, nearly drowned, and impaled on spikes, all within the vivid hallucination of the machine. Critics and parents flooded the BBC with complaints calling it sadistic and unsuitable for children. Newspapers printed headlines warning that the nation's beloved family show had turned into a horror serial. Mary Whitehouse, the self-appointed guardian of television morality, publicly condemned the episode, forcing the BBC to issue new content restrictions for the entire series. Behind the scenes, the backlash stunned the show's writers, who had meant it as a commentary on authoritarianism and media control. Tom Baker, who played the Doctor, defended the story's intelligence, but the BBC ordered future scripts to avoid psychological terror. The visual ambition of the series was crippled for years. Yet decades later, The Deadly Assassin is now seen as a turning point. It proved that Doctor Who could transcend children's entertainment and dive into political surrealism. The controversy it created became its legend. It asked one unthinkable question: what happens when imagination itself becomes too dangerous to air? Number 10. Star Trek, Patterns of Force, 1968. At the height of its optimism, Star Trek did something no American network show dared. It recreated a Nazi planet on primetime television. The episode Patterns of Force, disguised as social commentary, was so incendiary that it was banned in Germany for decades. Captain Kirk and Spock beamed down to a world modeled after the Third Reich, where a Federation historian has recreated totalitarian rule to prove its efficiency. The imagery was haunting. Uniform swastika-inspired flags, mass rallies, all rendered with unsettling accuracy. Viewers were forced to confront the moral question of order versus freedom. NBC censors were uneasy, but the producers pushed forward, believing that confronting evil directly was the only way to defeat it. The result, however, was global outrage. Germany and Austria refused to broadcast it, calling it dangerously insensitive. Even American critics accused the show of exploiting the most painful wounds of history for ratings. Behind the camera, the cast felt genuine discomfort. Leonard Nimoy, whose family had Jewish roots, later admitted that filming those scenes made him physically ill. William Shatner recalled the silence on set when extras saluted in Nazi regalia. The production nearly halted after complaints from studio staff who said it crossed the line from allegory to provocation. For years, the episode vanished from European syndication and became whispered legend among Trekkies, who traded grainy copies through underground fan circles. When it finally resurfaced, it was hailed as one of the bravest acts in television history. Patterns of Force remains a haunting reminder that science fiction's power lies not in escape, but confrontation. It asked audiences to face humanity's darkest truths and proved that even utopian dreams carry the shadow of history. Number 9. The Twilight Zone, The Encounter, 1964. The Twilight Zone was known for its moral lessons wrapped in surreal parables. But The Encounter went too far. It was the only episode pulled from circulation for over 2 decades. Its crime was honesty. It confronted the shame of war through the eyes of a Japanese American and an embittered veteran. Television was not ready for that kind of truth. The story begins innocently. 2 men, one young and one old, find themselves trapped in an attic with a samurai sword that seems to possess a supernatural will. The older man is a World War II veteran haunted by guilt. The younger man, played by George Takei, is a Japanese-American gardener whose presence stirs the veteran's paranoia. As the tension builds, the blade itself becomes alive, whispering ancient revenge. The episode ended not with peace, but murder. 1 man dead, 1 damned by his own hatred. CBS executives panicked immediately after the broadcast. Letters poured in accusing the network of racial insensitivity and psychological cruelty. Takei's performance was so raw that it blurred fiction and historical trauma. The network shelved the episode indefinitely, calling it too controversial for re-airing. Behind the scenes, Rod Serling, who had fought for racial progress in television, was devastated. He believed the story was misunderstood as propaganda rather than a warning about inherited hate. The Twilight Zone had always danced along the edge of moral discomfort, but this time it crossed into real history, and that proved fatal. For 20 years, fans whispered about the lost episode that dared to show an America divided by its own shadows. When it finally resurfaced in the late 80s, it became a cult object for those who saw art as a mirror, not a mask. The Encounter still cuts deep, reminding us that the most terrifying science fiction stories are the ones based on truth. Number 8. Space, 1999. The Testament of Arcadia, 1976. Space, 1999, was Europe's bold attempt to outdo Star Trek in both scale and philosophy. It mixed cosmic horror with mysticism long before such combinations were fashionable. The Testament of Arcadia, the show's season finale, took that ambition into forbidden territory, and the result unsettled even its own producers. The episode begins with Moonbase Alpha drifting through space when the crew discovers a dead planet that appears to be Earth's origin world. Strange energies pulse beneath its surface. Crew members fall under possession by unseen forces, compelling them to colonize the lifeless sphere. What unfolds is not a rescue mission, but a ritual of rebirth laced with death imagery and biblical echoes. Viewers expected sleek spaceships and scientific optimism. Instead, they got ghostly music, ritual chanting, and sacrificial overtones. ITV censors in the United Kingdom were horrified. They called it pagan television, a dangerous mixture of religion and science that blurred sacred lines. Religious groups demanded the series cancel any further use of spiritual symbolism. Behind the scenes, production chaos only deepened the legend. The director refused to cut scenes of the possessed crew walking like prophets through fog-covered ruins. The network delayed the broadcast in several regions and later edited entire sequences out of syndication. Critics at the time dismissed it as pretentious mysticism, but fans felt something cosmic had been awakened. When Space, 1999, ended the following year, fans pointed to the Testament of Arcadia as the moment it transcended mere entertainment. It was an accidental prophecy about the loneliness of creation and the danger of confusing science with destiny. Decades later, modern viewers hail it as an eerie masterpiece that dared to treat space not as a frontier, but as a graveyard. Number 7. The Quatermass Experiment, 1953. Before Doctor Who, before the X-Files, there was the Quatermass Experiment. Broadcast live on British television, it defined science fiction horror, but its final episode was so disturbing that only fragments of it survive. The BBC erased the tapes, claiming it was too extreme for rebroadcast. The story begins when an astronaut returns from space, possessed by something that is not human. His body begins to mutate, absorbing the life force of everything he touches. The camera lingered on his transformation in shadowy live close-ups that terrified audiences across Britain. People fainted in their living rooms. Newspapers demanded the BBC explain how such horror reached the airwaves. The censors labeled it indecent. Religious leaders called it blasphemy, disguised as science. For a nation still rebuilding from war, the idea that outer space could invade the human soul struck too close to home. The final act, in which the creature pleads for mercy inside Westminster Abbey before disintegrating into light, was considered emotionally traumatizing. Behind the scenes, the production team struggled to control the chaos of live television. Makeup melted under hot lights. Actors forgot lines. The horror felt unscripted because much of it was. Afterward, the BBC destroyed the master tapes rather than risk another public scandal. The Quatermass Experiment lived on as myth whispered about by generations of British sci-fi fans who called it the night television crossed a line. Its influence bled into Alien the Thing and nearly every story where humanity meets the cosmic unknown. It proved one truth, that science fiction's power lies not in the future it imagines, but in the fear it awakens right now. Number 6. Ultraman, The Monster Graveyard, 1966. In the golden age of Japanese sci-fi television, Ultraman was the shining hero of post-war optimism. But one episode shattered that image. The Monster Graveyard was supposed to be a story about memory and mercy. Instead, it became one of the darkest children's episodes ever aired and nearly banned afterward. The episode begins when the Science Patrol discovers a space dimension filled with the floating corpses of monsters Ultraman had destroyed. Their bodies drift silently through the void, their faces frozen in pain. It is a funeral in space, filmed with mournful music and eerie slow motion. When one creature returns to life and begs to be returned to the graveyard, Ultraman must fight it again, not out of hatred, but to restore peace. For a generation used to colorful explosions and heroic victory, this was devastation. Parents wrote to Tokyo Broadcasting System furious that their children had wept through the ending. Religious groups accused the show of glorifying death and teaching children to empathize with monsters. Behind the scenes, Tsuburaya Productions defended the episode, calling it a meditation on war guilt and responsibility. The studio had meant it as an allegory for Japan's own post-war conscience. The broadcast executives disagreed. They quietly ordered the series to avoid moral endings for the rest of the season, focusing instead on clear battles of good and evil. Years later, the episode resurfaced on home video and became revered among film historians who saw it as spiritual cinema hidden inside a monster show. The Monster Graveyard remains one of the most haunting pieces of television ever made because it dared to ask a forbidden question. What if the real tragedy of heroism is the cost of victory? Number 5. Night Gallery, The Caterpillar, 1972. Rod Serling returned to television after The Twilight Zone with Night Gallery, a darker, more adult vision of fear. But The Caterpillar went beyond psychological horror into something grotesque. When it first aired in Britain, it caused viewer complaints so severe that censors demanded it never reappear before midnight again. The story follows a colonial officer in Borneo who plots to murder his rival by hiring a local assassin to plant a deadly earwig in the man's head. But in a karmic twist, the parasite ends up inside his own ear, burrowing toward his brain. What follows is one of television's most infamous sequences of screaming madness and unseen agony. The episode's sound design was so realistic that many viewers believed it was real medical horror. NBC executives begged Serling to tone it down. He refused, arguing that horror should make the audience feel empathy through disgust. When complaints flooded the network after the broadcast, NBC cut the scene for future reruns. Behind the scenes, the makeup and audio teams reportedly spent days recording squelching noises, using fruit and insects to simulate the creatures burrowing. The network called it obscene. Critics, however, praised its moral weight. The episode was not about gore, but guilt. The officer survives only to discover that the creature laid eggs in his skull. For years, the episode was whispered about by late-night television fans as the one that crossed the line. Today, the caterpillar is seen as Serling's final masterpiece, a grim allegory of colonial arrogance and paranoia. It dared to say that the monsters we fear most are not crawling under our beds, but breeding inside our conscience. Number 4. The $6 Million Man, The Bionic Woman, 1975. The $6 Million Man was a family-friendly science fiction adventure. It had action optimism and heroism. But one two-part episode, The Bionic Woman, terrified its audience and shocked its network into censorship. The storyline introduced Jaime Summers, a woman who gains cybernetic limbs after a skydiving accident. But the surgery that saves her turns into a nightmare. Her body rejects the implants. She screams as her mechanical limbs twitch uncontrollably. The episode's final scene shows her dying on an operating table as machines beep relentlessly. It was not just tragic, it was traumatic. ABC received floods of calls from parents who said their children had nightmares for days. The network demanded the show's writers resurrect Jaime in a later story because the death scene was too depressing. Production staff were stunned. They had wanted to explore the limits of technology and humanity. The executives wanted a toy line. Behind the scenes, Lindsay Wagner, who played Jaime, performed the death scene so convincingly that crew members wept on set. The rawness of her breakdown broke television taboos about suffering and mortality in a sci-fi show. When ABC reluctantly approved her return, the resurrection storyline felt hollow compared to the original tragedy. Over time, fans rediscovered the original cut, which remains one of the most emotionally devastating moments in American sci-fi television. The Bionic Woman episode exposed what the genre feared to admit, that the dream of perfect technology might end not in salvation, but in sorrow. Number 3. The Invaders, The Mutation, 1967. The Invaders was America's Cold War fever dream. A lone man battling aliens who had secretly infiltrated human society. But the episode titled The Mutation pushed its paranoia to extremes that left even loyal fans unsettled. It begins in the deserts of Mexico, where David Vincent encounters a woman claiming to be an alien defector. She promises to help him expose her own kind. But as the episode unfolds, it becomes clear she is both victim and monster. Her skin peels under sunlight. Her emotions glitch between love and instinct. By the end, she disintegrates in his arms, begging for death. When ABC previewed the episode, executives wanted it shelved. They said it felt too sexualized, too grotesque, too tragic. The network reluctantly aired it once. Viewer response was explosive. Religious groups accused the show of promoting interspecies relationships. Critics called it nihilistic. It shattered the illusion that science fiction was safe escapism. Behind the scenes, the director insisted the episode was meant to mirror Cold War seduction, the danger of empathy between enemies. But the sponsors panicked. One major advertiser pulled its funding. The Invaders never fully recovered. Its tone grew safer, more predictable, and the bold storytelling of The Mutation was never repeated. Decades later, fans rediscovered the lost footage showing the alien's final transformation sequence cut from syndication because it resembled human decay. The Mutation now stands as one of the most daring and tragic sci-fi television hours ever broadcast. It blurred the line between horror and heartbreak, proving that alien invasion stories were really about our own fear of intimacy. It asked the question that television dared not answer: what if love itself is contamination? Number 2. Blake's 7, Orbit, 1981. Blake's 7 was the anti-Star Trek. It was grim, cynical, and written by people who believed heroes rarely survive. Yet even by its standards, the episode Orbit was shocking. It aired once uncut and then vanished for years, censored in multiple countries for psychological cruelty. In orbit, the rebel scientist Avon is stranded in space with his ally Vila. Their ship can escape orbit only if it lightens its load. Avon coldly calculates that one of them must die. What follows is a silent cat and mouse sequence that lasts nearly 10 minutes. No music, no dialogue, only breathing. Avon stalks Vila through narrow corridors, whispering his name with a gun in his hand. British television had never aired anything like it. Parents complained that it was pure terror, without blood or monsters. The BBC defended it briefly before bowing to pressure and cutting the scene in reruns. Critics debated whether it was genius or sadism. Behind the scenes, Paul Darrow, who played Avon later, said the scene haunted him for years. It was performed without stunt doubles and with minimal direction, relying entirely on tension. The silence was so heavy that camera operators forgot to move. When the episode ended, Avon spares Vila, but the damage was done. The audience had seen the true face of survival. Orbit was censored across Europe and pulled from afternoon slots. Yet it became a cult phenomenon, traded on bootleg VHS tapes among fans who called it the darkest hour of British sci-fi. Today, it is studied in film schools as an early masterpiece of minimalist horror. It stripped away spectacle and revealed what space really is: not adventure, not exploration, but isolation. Number 1. The Prisoner, Fallout, 1968. It was the finale that broke British television. The Prisoner, Fallout, wasn't just strange. It was an act of rebellion broadcast live to an unsuspecting nation. Audiences who tuned in expecting answers were met instead with chaos, masks, and revolution. Within minutes, the BBC switchboards exploded with angry calls. Many viewers thought they'd witnessed the end of sanity itself. The Prisoner had followed an unnamed spy, trapped in a surreal coastal village controlled by unseen forces. But in Fallout, every illusion collapses. The hero unmasks his captor, only to find himself behind the mask. Trial scenes dissolve into riots. Judges quote scripture. A masked assembly chants for freedom. The finale abandons logic entirely, turning into an operatic meditation on individuality versus conformity. ITV executives begged creator Patrick McGoohan to explain what it meant. He refused. "You're supposed to figure it out," he told reporters before vanishing overseas. British newspapers accused him of insulting the audience. Some called the episode psychotic television, yet others hailed it as genius, an allegory for man's endless struggle against invisible control. Behind the scenes, production chaos mirrored the story. Actors were given pages minutes before filming. McGoohan directed through exhaustion and paranoia, sleeping in his car between takes. Crew members quit, declaring the finale incomprehensible. But McGoohan's defiance was deliberate. He wanted the ending to feel like escape and collapse all at once. When Fallout aired again years later, critics finally understood. It wasn't nonsense, it was prophecy. A warning about surveillance, obedience, and the illusion of freedom. The finale's final words still echo like a riddle through television history: "Be seeing you." Across decades, these extreme moments remind us that science fiction has never been about lasers or spaceships. It is about fear memory and the limits of what we dare to see. What other hidden episodes lie buried, waiting to be rediscovered? Like, subscribe, and tell us which forbidden moment you think should have never been censored at all.